to this idea of what's the probability of this is how would can we put a number on it?
Well, life is so complex. Even that simplest bacterium is so complex you couldn't actually calculate a probability of life forming. But we don't have to do that. We can calculate, using some assumptions, the probability of a protein forming, given you've got the right ingredients, all the 20 amino acids, the left-handed ones, and without all the right-handed ones, because that sort of halves the probability. Because if you've got 40 instead of 20, I mean, you've got to select just the 20. That means you've got 40 to choose from instead of 20. So let's make it just 20.
Yeah.
To make it a bit easier. And then let's just take a small protein, like 150 amino acids long, and what would be the probability of getting those 150 amino acids in the correct order? So how do you calculate that? Well, 1 over 20 is choose the first one, choose the second one, 1 over 20, so multiply them together, and then you multiply that 150 times, 1 over 20 times 1 over 20 times 1 over 20, 150 times. So it's 1 in 10 to the power of 195 is the probability of it forming by chance. Right. And also we've assumed that these amino acids can string together without an enzyme, which of course we don't have yet, and that won't happen. And that's another problem with the story. But so the probability of getting one small protein, just one, not 400, just one, is 1 in 10 to the power of 195. And can anybody imagine that number? No, that's just way beyond. In fact, they calculated that the universe has 10 to the power of 80 electrons. That's a number with 80 zeros. So this is a number with 195 zeros. And so there's a guy at MIT actually calculated, assuming the universe was as old as the Big Bang and all that sort of thing, and how big the universe was, and how many events could have happened in the universe in that time frame. Was every molecular vibration or something in that massive time, and how many events would that be? 10 to the power of 120 is the maximum number of events in the universe, given its evolutionary assumptions about its age and everything.
When you say events, just explain what you mean.
Well, that just means something can happen. Not necessarily a full experiment with all the amino acids and everything, but just the number of events, number of things that actually tick, tick, or whatever, anything. 10 to the power of 120. So we've got 10 to the power of 195 for this one protein. In other words, it would never happen.
How does the dream team assemble without enzymes? You need enzymes. And that brings me to the biggest problem, the biggest hurdle of all, which is information. You see, having organic biomolecules, that's one thing. And we're talking about you've got to have the right biomolecules. We're still a long way from making the right biomolecules in labs. So having the biomolecules is one thing, but organizing these very simple biomolecules into segments of RNA or DNA that are capable of reproducing themselves, as well as building proteins, it's a whole nother story together. And now we're lifting things up to an incredible place of chance. So what kind of chance are we talking about? Well, here's a little video that I'm going to play, which gives you some kind of idea about the chances involved with constructing a very simple protein.
When applied to the origin of life and the random formation of large biomolecules, probability theory clarifies the limitations of chance as a creative agent on the primordial Earth. For example, what are the odds a single protein could form exclusively through the blind interactions of chemistry? Our target is one smaller than average molecule made from 150 amino acids, each aligned to ensure a folded chain. Researchers have calculated that on the ancient Earth, the probability of success was 1 chance in 10 to the 164th power. That's 1 correctly sequenced protein chain for every 100 million trillion 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 failed attempts.
Okay, so you get the idea, okay? When we're talking about, what we've created in labs, are really just precursor biomolecules. That's all. How do those biomolecules actually self-assemble? How do they do that to the point in which they can reproduce? How do they assemble to produce complex proteins like this? And of course, as we're talking about astronomical chances that are essentially mean zero. Now, it's at this point usually that those who are skeptical of ID or who don't believe in God, they say, well, look, there's a chance. So I guess it just happened. The universe is big enough, and I guess even though it's basically impossible, I guess there's a chance, and so it happened. And this is where another chapter from this book comes into play. Douglas Axe, he wrote a chapter in this book which is excellent, and he talks about this concept of chance and how it plays into the way we process things. He says that basically what we do as humans, when things happen in our life that are sort of a little bit out of the ordinary, we either attribute that to a coincidence or we attribute it to insight. And this is really interesting. So, for example, you leave your city, you go to the other side of the country, and you're in a tiny restaurant in the boonies somewhere, and you bump into a college classmate. And you think to yourself, wow, well, that's a coincidence. That's amazing that we bumped into each other. And let's just say that that person doesn't live in that state either. They live in another state. And that you both happen to converge at the same time in the same restaurant. And so you say to yourself, that's a coincidence. But then you're thinking to yourself, now is it? Is it possible that maybe some divine plan is at work, in which case it's not a coincidence, it's actually some kind of insight? And so we do this as humans, don't we? Think about times when things have happened in your life and you're trying to figure out whether it's a coincidence or whether, God's trying to tell you something. It's some kind of insight. And so what happens is those committed to a materialist only explanation, they tend to default to coincidence. Well, I guess it's just a coincidence. But as Douglas Axe goes on to say, this is absolutely ridiculous because it's not just about one person turning up in a restaurant. Imagine that it's not just one of your classmates that are there. Imagine you go to this restaurant and every single one of your classmates, all 30 of them, happen to be in this restaurant at the same time. Now, at this point, do you defer to coincidence? No, of course not. What do? You know this is insight. This has been planned. And of course, what you find out is that someone has secretly put together a class reunion. All right? It was planned. And so in that situation, we use reason. This is how we reason things out. We know that you could put a number on this. What's the number of getting all your classmates into the same restaurant at the same time? It's probably a very high number. It wouldn't be anywhere near as high as what it takes to get a biological entity itself, but it would still be pretty high. Yet we know that if that happens, it wasn't a coincidence. So we can't defer to chance. We can't just say, well, it was just a chance. It was a coincidence. No, our minds tell us, no, this was specially designed. And this is exactly where we must go when it comes to areas of life. We know that the chances, even given the immensity of the universe, the chances are too astronomically high. We must, at this point, use our reason and defer to insight. And of course, if we do that, that brings us ultimately to the only other alternative, which is special creation. So in special creation, we can use science to follow exactly how these molecules come together, or exactly what sequence they come together in. But we've got to know, as we are looking into the science, that this is insight, design. A supernatural design was involved, which means, of course, that now you have escaped the realms of science. But that's okay. It's okay to defer to a metaphysical explanation. If you don't, you are simply going against what is reasonable and what is rational. It's not about the science needs to explain this. The fact is, at this point, you've moved to a barrier. It's a
Evolution is teaching how we all have a common ancestor is what it's teaching. And so a single cell became you through the process. But getting to that first single cell, life from non-life, a lot of people consider that different or distinct because they might call it chemical evolution, which is chemicals evolving rather than living things evolving. So some people like to keep those separate. The thing that pulls them together, I believe, is that in order to be an atheist and claim that you're a rational thinker, in other words, you think there's no God or you don't believe there's a God. If you're going to rationally believe that, you need to find a totally natural way to get from non-life to life. Otherwise, you're believing in something that no one can accept. It's not